Thank you guys for coming out. I really appreciate you sharing some of your time with me this evening. There's some familiar faces in here and some faces that I don't recognize but will after tonight. So to get into it, we're talking about sustainable forestry and managing your forest. So a good way to begin would be working on a definition of sustainable forestry. So when we think about sustainable, some synonyms would be to maintain, to continue, to carry on. And forestry is often defined as the art and science of managing forests. So to put that together, sustainable forestry can be thought of as to manage the forest for today and into the future. What we're going to talk about today, there's three main issues, the middle one taking up the majority of our time. I want to focus first on the backyard forest. I acknowledge that everyone has different ownership opportunities. Some people own a small parcel and other people may own more land. So trying to provide some actionable steps for everyone in here and looking at some of the opportunities in the backyard first, then moving on to the woodlot, and then providing a couple additional resources for you to explore at the end of the day. So when we think about the backyard forest, it's the trees adjacent to your home. It can be the focus of a large or small property. Just from, it's the way, what you see when you go up your driveway to your home. So these trees can often be open grown. What's defined as open grown, just meaning that they've been out in the open for a long time. So instead of developing tight crowns and vertical growth, they can be bushy, those big oak trees, those big beautiful maple trees. And so while these trees are managed differently than the ones in the forest, we have a nice opportunity to provide some specialized attention and invest some more time and resources to ensure the goals of the backyard forest are met. So one thing to consider about the backyard forest and the trees is you want to maintain the right trees for the site. If you were thinking of doing some enrichment plantings, you wouldn't want to put a pine or an aspen or really any tree under the power line that feeds to your house. I know that's a simple example, but eventually that tree is going to get so tall that it would have to be removed. So when we think about, trees in proximity to our home, there's certain risk tolerances for how large the tree will be, but probably what would be best is shrubs and other vegetation directly around the home, and then some trees that you can leave in islands off to the side. So just thinking about, the spatial arrangement when you're thinking about the trees and the property around your home. So the talk next week, I think, will hit on a lot of great opportunities to manage some of these resources and gardens for wildlife. UNH Extension, specifically Matt Tarr, has put together a lot of really great YouTube resources and lectures that are available for pollinators or birds or other wildlife, a lot of diverse mast and shrub and forb habitat that we can do in the close proximity to our house to really improve our wildlife that's on site. So when we're talking about the backyard forest, there's three recommendations that I want to share with you. It's just basic mulching, basic pruning, and some opportunities for release of those trees that you're leaving on site. So when you think about mulching plants, it helps to benefit the available soil moisture. It regulates temperature in the summer and in the colder months, and it can mitigate some of that traffic and damage. If we mow our lawn and then run the string trimmer around the base of the tree, every time you're hitting that bowl and the tree bowl with the weed eater, you could be damaging the bark and eventually girdling or causing extra stress on the tree. So putting some mulch around the edge helps mitigate that damage. We want to do wide and not deep, so really only 2 to 4 inches of mulch, and trying to focus right around the drip edge, which is the edge of the canopy. And you can do organic mulches, which have to be refreshed, but they decompose and add nutrients to the soil, or inorganic mulches, which wouldn't require any maintenance. Just a little visual here. We want to avoid doing what's called a mulch volcano and putting a large, composition. It seems silly, but if you drive to some of the buildings around Tenny Mountain Highway, you'll see those crews, and they'll put the mulch, a foot up the stem. We want to think about like donuts and having a hole around the base of the tree. The trunks flare at the base, and you want to leave the entirety of that flare free to have air circulate around it to prevent mold growth and other problems. So no mulch volcanoes, we want mulch donuts. If you are to prune your trees or have a tree company prune your trees, which we could do to try to mitigate risk, if we have some ice storm damage, which we periodically do, if you have branches that are damaged during windstorm events, you want to try to implement what's called a 3-stage cut, and we'll talk about pruning locations, but ideally, if this was the branch, you place the first cut on the underside of the tree, the second cut is further out so that as all the weight from that branch collapses, it closes the hinge and breaks away, and then you can make the final cut just outside of what's called the branch collar. And the branch collar is kind of like that same concept of how the trunk flares out. You know, the branch collar, it flares away from the tree, so that third cut is made in a way that the tree can heal around the wound. Wrong way.
You don't want it parallel to the main trunk?
No, so if we make this cut parallel to the main trunk, what you're actually doing is increasing the surface area of the wound, whereas like at each branch node is an opportunity to do some pruning. So that ties into this slide where if you have a tree service company come in, or if you were to do it yourself, you want to avoid the practice of what's called topping or giving like a uniform haircut. We don't want to just shape the trees without respect to their natural growth forms. So like what you want to do is try to make these pruning cuts at different unions and different laterals. So you can take it right down, kind of more towards the bowl of the stem, or you can prune individual branches, but just trying to maintain that branch collar, which might not be as aesthetically uniform, but it allows the tree to respond in a better way. So a little bit of facts about how the trees respond. They utilize a process called CODIT, which is compartmentalization of decay in trees. You can see why it's a shortened acronym. But basically, what happens is the tree forms different walls where it creates kind of a barrier from the wound and the rot that's occurring after damage from it spreading towards the rest of the tree. So the first wall is the vertical. It prevents the wound from going up and down the bowl. The second would be the inward growth. Then we work on the lateral, and then lastly it creates some healing wood around the exterior of the tree. So to go back to the top of the slide, we want to try to trim trees during the dormancy period, which is after leaf off, and the reason being that all the nutrients go from the upper canopy and they go down into the roots. So when you prune during the dormancy period, in the spring when we have that flush of new growth, all of the nutrients can respond to that wound. It's best just to not do it, in the heat of summer during a drought. There's not as much available nutrients, or the response just isn't as successful. So as with many things, young trees are more resilient and adaptable to change. So when we think about pruning, you want to try to limit the percentage of the canopy that you prune to 50% in young trees, 25% in middle-aged trees, and 10% in old trees. So when thinking about that big maple tree in your backyard, you don't want to take off a lot at one time. It can be a process over several years. The last thing we'll talk about for the backyard forest is what's referred to as release, which is also a concept that applies to working in the woodlot. We want to look at it from a bird's eye view and see where the crown is competing with other trees. And we can do either a 1 to 4 sided release. So if you were to divide the tree into quadrants, you can try to create more growing space for the canopy to expand and the tree to have more available sunlight and a larger crown. One concept to keep in mind, both in the backyard and in the woods, is a concept that's referred to as wind firmness. So as trees grow and develop, they're exposed to a given amount of wind. And so think about it, if I grow up in a community and if we were to all stand in this room really tight together versus being out on your own, as the wind comes in, the roots have developed to stabilize, from the prevailing wind. So if you take a tree that's grown into a tight community and leave it as the only one in a field, on certain soils there's a higher risk of wind throw. So again, similar to pruning, maybe doing those more aggressive clearings over time if you have mature trees that you're trying to keep for landscape purposes. Saturated soils have a higher risk of wind throw than drier sites, but just maybe take your time, let the trees respond. They just need time to recover from different things. Are there any questions for backyard concepts before we transition to the larger forest? Go ahead.
Can you talk about a little bit about mulching? I noticed some people use wood chips, which I understand actually draw nutrients away from the soil while they're trying to decompose, versus bark mulch or other kinds of mulch. Can you talk about like, the different kinds of grades?
Right. The specific grades I would have to do maybe a little bit more research on.
Yeah.
But like the concept that I know about is if you're thinking about the soil acidity, and like if you want more of an acidic soil for blueberries, you want to use like softwood mulch, whereas hardwood mulch is more universally applicable. As far as like different grades of mulch, I'd have to look into it more. I'm sorry.
I have a question about mulch also. I don't mulch, but I just let the normal forest stuff accumulate. Should I be clearing that away from the base of the tree?
It would depend, you know. It's to paint a dramatic example. If we're making a large, if we're putting our leaf pile against trees, that's not great. But right, if it's just naturally accumulating, I don't think it's anything to worry about. That's you know the natural process that happens in the woods. I think the rate of decomposition because of the mesic, you know, the wet conditions that we have in the woods, the decomposition rate's actually really rapid. So I wouldn't worry about it. So to get into looking at the larger landscape for managing our forests, I try to think of managing our forest as like planting and harvesting the gardens that we maintain if you have a backyard garden. There's sunlight, there's soil, there's the spacing of the plants and how the plants are grouped together. We have crops and weeds, and eventually you tend to harvest the mature crops. Forests are often described in stands, and then when the stands are aggregated together, they make up the forested landscape. And so to continue the analogy, it'd be like garden beds versus the entirety of your garden. You can have a garden bed that, you know, this is where your broccoli is, and then you have your tomato plants, and that's where your hemlock stand is, and that's where your pine is. So just thinking about it that way, I feel like helps. And so when we think about how to lay out your garden, you know, you make a plan of where you're going to plant and what you're going to have where. I try to recommend, and everyone should try to take some time to define the goals and objectives. You know, some people are really valuing recreation on their property. Other folks are worried about wildlife habitat. So the idea is this is your property, and you need to have those goals and objectives defined so that you can move forward with a desired future condition in mind. It's really beneficial to write them down after you've spent a period of time marinating them. A professional, you know, a forester as part of a management plan can maybe ask some questions and tease it out through conversations to help you. And then we refer to this throughout the planning and implementation process. So a concept that I like to share is just that the timeline of a forest exceeds the lifetime of an individual person. So the decisions that we make have ramifications if it's going to stay in the family for your kids or whoever you leave it to, or, you know, the future owner. So like we talked about earlier, I just try to that end, think about a holistic approach where we're evaluating the soils and thinking about what would ideally grow where, those the forest health, the forest resiliency, diversity, wildlife habitat, water quality, and then timber production and carbon as well. When thinking about how you want to manage your property, I'll just put a plug in here about managing beyond your borders. Wildlife species in particular do not stay within our old stone wall that bounds our property. Different species have different home acreages, and a common recommendation from the Bartlett Experimental Forest and some of the really great wildlife biologists there is to look at 10 times your ownership. And just aerial photos are great for that. You know, how many fields are in the area? How many shrubby young forest areas are there? Do you own the only softwood stand in the entire landscape? Those diverse opportunities are probably providing unique niches for different wildlife species. So one of the first steps when trying to think about what to do on your property is to understand what's currently there. When we think about composition, we can do a formal forest inventory where we're going out and using statistics and taking a subset of the forest to get, you know, species densities and percentages. A less formal way is to do a walkthrough with a resource professional, which I would encourage you to go out with the individual and talk about what they're seeing. You know, each forest is unique, and based on the topography and the species and the hydrology, so to have questions as they come up be answered through a walkthrough is a great opportunity. The composition of our forests are driven by disturbance, just meaning how are they originated, or how have they been tended along the way. We've had a lot of our forest originated from farm abandonment, and that is why those stone walls are prevalent in the middle of the woods on a hillside that's, beyond what I would want to carry a boulder up. But there was also the 1938 hurricane, or there can be, regenerative cuts that someone implemented in the past that could that drive the origin of the stand. There's also, so when we think about the composition of our forest, there's two buckets. Most forests can be described as even-aged, which means, those stand replacing events, that large hurricane, the farm was abandoned and everything has grown up in the interim period. Or they're uneven aged, where you have, microbursts or ice storms or individual trees fall down, where the ages of the trees is highly varied. Or it can be previously managed, where someone puts some small openings in and you've had seedlings and saplings regenerate over time. When thinking about your forest and what the composition is, we want to think about the diversity of it. What are the age classes like we said, even-aged or uneven-aged, which often describe the individual stands. And then at the forest level, you want to evaluate what that looks like. There's species diversity, whether it's hardwood, softwood, sugar maple, beech, all the species that we have on site. One thing, when thinking about your forest, that I like to share is you want to try to maintain like a diversified portfolio. With the insects and disease threats that we have, you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket. If your forest was heavily dominated by white ash, you know that emerald ash borers come into the area and unfortunately caused a lot of problems. So there's a silviculturist at the Yale School of Forestry that has an expression that I like, which is you want everybody on the bus. You can choose to do certain things down the road, but trying to maintain the highest species diversity at the time is a great opportunity. More driven by a wildlife perspective, there's vertical structure and horizontal structure. So to slow down and explain these, vertical structure is, how many seedlings and forbs and graminoids are there, what's the mid-story like, and what's the overstory like. Do we have, multiple layers, or is it like Central Park where it's grass and then you just have mature trees? And then there's horizontal structure, which is the composition within the layers. How widely spaced are our trees? What is the density of them? And again, what is that species composition? So now, to go back to our garden analogy, we have the crops and the weeds, where our crop trees are what you typically want to grow to maturity. They're often what drive the value of any harvest that you choose to do. And I think that they're very aesthetically pleasing, and you want those tall, straight trees. There's a fair amount of nuance in what your crop trees are and what your weeds are, but I'm sure you've all seen those that kind of resemble a kid's crazy straw. Somehow the tree is not straight. We want nice straight trees. What can be a misconception is that smaller trees are younger trees, but based on that even age structure or even uneven age structure, sometimes the trees in the understory are the same tree age as the trees in the overstory, and different species will have different capacities to respond to release, meaning like if we take out the overstory, some of the trees in the understory, some species will respond well, others will not. The short answer is most will not. They just don't, they've been suppressed for so long that they won't have the opportunity to grow into your future crop trees. So this image here just talks about the canopy classes as defined. You have your dominant trees, which are somewhat rare. They're the first ones to pioneer. They're the tallest and biggest trees. What we most often have are what's referred to as co-dominant trees. They're kind of all the same height. It's how tall the average trees are in your forest. Intermediate trees are the ones that are kind of peeking through and competing with those co-dominant trees, and then you have your suppressed trees. So most of our weeds that you kind of want to remove throughout managing your forest from timber management perspective are the suppressed and intermediate trees because they won't respond to that release. So you've taken on this big effort to learn your landscape, to learn your forest, and if you were looking forward to maybe move forward with active management, it might be an opportunity to involve a resource professional just because there's quite a bit of nuance, and having somebody be an ally is invaluable. So if it's a larger project, then enrichment plantings or firewood harvests or some small diameter release or anything that you feel comfortable with, working with a logger or a forester to use timber harvesting to achieve those goals and objectives is an appropriate next step. I think earlier we talked about going for a walk in the woods with these folks, and that's a great opportunity to see if it's a good fit to work with this person going forward. Do you get a good feeling? Do you have a good relationship? Do you feel like you're being heard, or whatever else matters most to you in a working relationship? So when looking forward to the management and harvest, it comes after understanding the current conditions. It comes after defining your goals and objectives, because you want to have the end goal in mind. And I refer to timber harvest as a tool, the how to achieve those goals that you have. So when thinking about implementing a harvest, there's 4 main steps. There's the layout, there's marking, there's the actual harvest, and then there's the closeout work after most of the equipment has left. So the layout and marking should be implemented from prescriptions, meaning harvest styles based on the conversations or the goals or objectives that you've defined. We should work to having a written contract. UNH Extension has a great example contract that you can refer to or compare to what someone else might provide. We want to flag the boundaries so we mitigate any timber trespass. Or, if you say, I don't want to go within 100 feet of my home to maintain a buffer, like making sure that those boundaries are appropriately marked on the ground. The layout involves knowing where all the wood's going to be consolidated and processed and the trucks are going to go at the landing, how the traffic network's going to be there through skid trails, and what's going to happen where via the harvest prescriptions. There's a fair amount of marking that can happen if you work with a forester, which is designating which trees are cut and which trees are left, and designating the boundaries of what happens where. That can occur with paint as well. One tip that I think is great for all landowners to do is to review that layout and marking on the ground before operations begin, just to do like a final site inspection before the equipment comes, because once a tree is cut and severed from the stump, it is real hard to put it back, and I wouldn't recommend it. So there's some permitting and paperwork required to do a harvest in the state of New Hampshire, but that should be handled by the logger or the forester. This is an example of a sale area map. It just shows that there's different prescriptions happening in different locations. You can see that there's a landing here. You have a couple trails that are consolidating wood at that landing. There's some thinnings happening here. Some leaf trees are marked here. There's a clear cut here. And there's adjacent areas that are untouched. So we don't have to treat an entire property with one prescription. And that's often not what's right for the site. Just based off that previous management, you want to tailor what you're applying to what's on the ground. So when we think about conducting a harvest, I try to frame it as there's 2 categories. There's intermediate and there's regenerative. And so intermediate is, in the middle. It is like tending your garden, where you're removing some of the weeds and mature crop that is ready to be taken off the landscape. And so we're not necessarily worried about the seedlings and saplings that are on the landscape, because we're promoting those future crop trees. If your corn stalks were already this tall, you're not gonna, I'm not a gardener, but I don't think you're worried about necessarily what's going on the ground level as much. And then a regenerative harvest is starting fresh or placing, a patch within the existing garden. And that regenerative harvest could be because the entire crop is mature, or it can be that, someone else didn't do a great job and things have been somewhat high graded where, it's so weedy and unacceptable that the best option is to start fresh. The intermediate harvest is, like I said, to tend and develop the existing stand. We can do what's referred to as a crop tree release, similar to the backyard. You think about how many trees are touching the crown of your individual trees and mark those accordingly. And and thin out the forest in a way to achieve those goals that you have. So a rule of thumb is that you'll see 2 inches of diameter growth, which is the horizontal unit, often in inches, usually at breast height, which is 4.5 feet. You'll see about 2 inches of growth per 10 years. So if you were to, and by doing these types of thinnings in crop tree release, you can increase that growth rate. So if we were to release a 15-inch tree, 10 years later that tree could be 17 or 18 inches. Just over time, that's kind of the growth rate of trees in the area. When we think about those regenerative harvests, we're really spoiled in New Hampshire in that we don't have to run around with shovels and seedling bags and after a harvest and plant a bunch of seedlings. Things will regenerate naturally. But what to keep in mind is how we will harvest will directly impact what will grow. So there's 2 main factors to think about of what grows where. It is light and site. And by site, I mean the soil that's on site, the aspect, the amount of available water, and we can't control the site. Unless maybe you own a bunch of equipment and want to recontour things, but that's all we can think about is light. And so there are, there's a gradient of shade tolerance that each species has. Some species are shade intolerant, meaning that they need full sunlight. Paper birch and aspen are great examples. It is unlikely to recruit those species unless they have full sunlight. And shade intolerant species would be like our beech and hemlock that really can persist underneath that canopy. They've developed in such ways to do well in low light conditions. So a concept that's always preached is don't fight the site. Use the web soil survey through NRCS to understand what your soils are. Walk the ground, understand if things are mesic or droughty. And Good Forestry in the Granite State, which is a publication, has a great resource called Important Forest Soil Groups. And I'm not a soil scientist, so I don't know how many hundreds of different soil series there are in the state. But the Important Forest Soil Groups lumps them into about 4 categories, and I believe it's like softwood dominated, hardwood dominated, a mix. It simplifies that list of several hundred species to help you succeed and from a forest management perspective. When we think about doing a regenerative harvest, I kind of touched on it a little bit. It can be a great tool to increase the diversity, both species, like recruiting those shade intolerant species, and age class. If we think about it, it's nice to have some age class diversity so that different parts of the forest are maturing at different times so we can sustainably come back and harvest our property. Regenerative harvests are great to provide early successional habitat, which is that usually referred to as 0 to 10 years of age for a forest, where we have these really dense saplings, this brushy habitat. It provides a lot of cover for ground nesting birds and lower nesting birds from predators, both raptors and on the ground. So a regenerative harvest can be used to create a future crop as well, like I mentioned. So there's a couple different categories for regenerative harvest. You can do it via single tree, but rather than list them all, we'll just go over them. So a single tree selection can look pretty similar to a thinning or a crop tree release, but instead of being as concerned about our future crop, we're more trying to recruit some regeneration in the understory and make some small openings to promote those individual species. It's best done on enriched sites because sugar maple can persist and other more desirable species. If you are trying to get some hemlock for softwood cover, it's a great resource, but beech is our primary weed in New Hampshire and does really well in low light conditions. You can go back to forests that have been cut 5 years later, and with the way that the beech leaves persist on the tree, you'll just see a wall of orange. So from a regeneration perspective, I don't view this as the best tool in the toolkit, but if you are interested in it, whether you're doing a thinning or this single tree selection or crop tree release, I think it's best to try to lay out your skid trails ahead of time, have your transportation network kind of planned out, and then have the operator pick off of those trails. It just minimizes the footprint. It's a little more intentional about what's coming out, and every tree has a path out without damaging the ones that you want to keep. A shelterwood harvest does really well for mid-tolerant species. It's most often implemented for red oak and white pine. The intent here is that these mid-tolerant species are kind of the Goldilocks and the most difficult at times to recruit. They want that medium amount of sunlight. So what you want to do is leave density of overstory trees and remove all the weeds, remove those intermediate and suppressed trees to provide dappled sunlight and develop a cohort of seedlings and saplings, kind of like this picture. We have all these pines that are established, and usually about 5 years after you do the establishment cut, you remove most of the overstory to release these trees, and that becomes the future. Shelterwood systems are really good for, like I said, oak and pine, and I often say that they look like a park. They look like a park for the density of spacing. A seed tree is like a shelterwood, but you're leaving fewer trees. It can be as few as just a couple per acre, and so it works better for those shade intolerant species like our birches, and pine can do well as in there. The only thing with pine, like some of you may know, is the white pine weevil. So if we allow too much light on those seedlings, an insect will lay an egg in the terminal bud that kills that terminal bud. You'll have a secondary leader develop, and it just impacts the growth form and quality of the tree. So we want to use more of a shelterwood system to allow those trees to develop and minimize damage from the weevil. Group selection works really well for those mid-tolerant to shade-intolerant species. I like to say it's like if you were to roll a sheet of cookie dough out on your kitchen counter, take some cookie cutters, and then pull the dough out, and that's essentially what you've done. You've done a regenerative harvest. You've most often cleared down to the ground level, and hardwoods, because of that beech component and those shade-tolerant species, you want to make the openings a little bit larger, whereas our softwoods, ideally, we have some advanced regeneration that we can release, but trying to do like up to maybe a half acre just because they tend to be more mid-tolerant with our spruce and hemlock. And just as a note too, like hardwoods do really well stump sprouting. So up to a certain extent, those smaller trees will respond vigorously when they've been cut, whereas softwoods don't have that component. So winter harvest in softwood units is really good. The snow can provide some insulation while the equipment's in the area, and trying to rely on the advanced regeneration rather than starting fresh. For our groups, I try to think about if you are to do group selection in an area, you try not to treat more than 20%. The idea being a common return interval is every 20 years. So that means as our trees take about 100 years to mature, you have 5 entries spaced 20 years apart, gets you to 100 years. Ideally, after, whoever's owned the land for that 100 years, by the time you get back to the first opening, it's mature and ready for another harvest. Patch cuts and clear cuts, I think everyone knows what these are. It's taking down the majority of the stems within an area, but these work really well for our shade intolerant species. It's a great recruiting opportunity for those early successional habitat, and providing soft mass with our pin cherries, our blackberries, our raspberries. It's often said that there's a deficit of early successional habitat in the state and in the Northeast region. So if you are a larger landowner, or if the conditions warrant it, you could consider implementing these on your property. So when we get into implementation, there's a couple different flavors it can take to move forward. We can do conventional, which would be chainsaws and cable skidders, or mechanical, which has more equipment with feller bunchers and grapple skidders. The mechanical tends to be quicker. The equipment is larger, whereas conventional, they can maybe work some steeper slopes, but I don't even necessarily think that's appropriate. There's whole tree harvesting, where we chip the tops and send them to the biomass plants. And then there's roundwood harvesting, where the tops are taken to what can be processed as pulp, usually down to 3 inches or so. And then the remainder of that wood is left on site. The benefit of whole tree harvesting is it's a lot easier to walk around your property after. The benefit of roundwood harvesting is that there's those tops left on site for nutrient cycling. There was a study done at Bartlett that said that the difference in nutrient cycling between whole tree and roundwood was negligible. But the roundwood harvest, those tops can also be really beneficial for corduroying or armoring skid trails in wet areas, which is basically you put the brush where it's wet or where the soils are soft, and it helps mitigate and disperse that ground pressure of the equipment. The sale administration process is where you're overseeing the harvest. If you have a Foerster, they will take care of that for you. If you work directly with the logger, you essentially, they're looking over their own operation, but you are the one responsible for maintaining your own standards. There's sale admin on the ground, just making sure things are being implemented as discussed and as planned. And then there's some work in the office, just consolidating paperwork and writing the payment checks. So one thing that I like to make note of is the middle of a harvest versus the final product of the harvest. Just with all this equipment and everything that's going on, it can take a little time for things to open up. In the winter, we have to remove the snow and let trees kind of freeze up, and that point in the middle can be a little messy. But through closeout work and understanding that the final product isn't there yet, usually you can get the result that you want. So just closeout is the last step of the harvest. Most of the equipment's gone. We try to think about erosion control, most often putting in water bars on steep slopes, which are basically diversion ditches to get the water off of the skid trail. As we know, water, when it gains velocity, momentum, volume, it can lead to a lot of erosion, so those water bars are important on primary skid trails and on slopes. We want to recontour the land, like I alluded to, smoothing out those ruts, closing out the landing, and any trails that you may have had ahead of time, just making sure, or installing new ones. That can all be done during the closeout process, and working on our access control with boulders or deadwood or gates to make sure there's no damage done by equipment or vehicles that you don't want on site. And seeding, if you would like to speed things up in the landings or other areas. So one of the rewarding parts is getting to monitor a project after it's been done. And so keeping those goals in mind, as we have throughout the whole process, we can look at how the forest is responding, whether those crop trees that we left on site and what's regenerating. And we can look at wildlife, how wildlife's responded to the choices that we've made through game cameras, through birding outings, or through winter tracks. We want to monitor on a less positive note for forest pests and disease and invasive species, and just understanding how things are changing on the landscape between our entries. Some of those additional resources I alluded to earlier, you can read the resource Good Forestry in the Granite State and a publication on why trees grow where they do in New Hampshire. Information, county foresters, consulting foresters, really natural resource professionals, and UNH Extension is a great resource. The USDA, NRCS offers different funding for certain projects to help mitigate some of those cost share opportunities, and project management can be done by a consulting forester. And we'll open it up to questions now. It's So the question was, how do we work to size our clear cuts? And if we were to have, we talked about group selection and 20%, would 20 acres out of 100 be appropriate? It would really depend on your goals and objectives, which I know is an amorphous answer, but I can't remember the exact acreage, but larger openings for wildlife have the opportunity to recruit new species, and I believe that threshold is 10 acres, but I might not be correct on that. So what that means is if we do a smaller opening, you'll provide habitat opportunity for birds that are already in the area, as it's most often talked about with birds, but once we cross that threshold, you can recruit new species to the area. As far as like how to manage your clear cut, I guess I would encourage you to manage it at the stand level while also taking in the aesthetic considerations and how else the property is being used. I know that sometimes there's a view shed analysis that can be done pretty easily through Google Earth, where we can create polygons and say, either from this mountain view top or from Squam Lake, what is the project going to look like when we're done? So, if it's in northern industrial Maine, a clear cut could be, the entirety of a block, and there's no upper limit. So it depends, but I guess I would encourage, if you're making a choice to do a clear cut, you've evaluated it at this stand level. And either you can space it out a little bit to mitigate some of that aesthetic difference, but try to treat the entirety of the stand in the way that's going to allow it to respond the best. If you were to have a 100-acre property that was high graded, you probably don't want to treat it all at once, but you could do it in patches unless you're one of those truly large landowners that is managing it solely for timber. The question was about forest resiliency and trying to buffer in some of that for our forests in the face primarily of insects and disease. And I think that ties back to what I was talking about with the Yale forestry professor who says we want to have everybody on the bus. And so it can be common based on the soils. There are certain species that really thrive to have a forest dominated by a certain species composition. I mean, and so like when I worked at West Point down in southern New York, it was very heavy to red oak. And I was often concerned about gypsy moth, and even if like oak blight or something else came through, you know, it's a forest that's largely dominated by one species. So what we can do to that is either enrichment plantings at some point, if you're willing to be more hands-on, or trying to retain those minor components within the forest. So if I'm working in a hardwood stand and there's one hemlock tree, I'm going to make sure to retain that hemlock tree. I've heard from wildlife biologists that those individual trees can have a really high value, specifically softwoods within a sea of hardwood. And I've seen it on the ground. You know, in the winter you might find a deer bed under that one softwood tree. So, you know, softwood hardwood's a pretty easy example, but if you have some black cherry on the landscape or really anything that's unique to the site, it's beneficial to maintain it. That's more from an ecological perspective than like straight timber production, but I think the same thing applies. We don't want to put all the eggs in one basket. Yeah. So the question was about farmland abandonment and specifically apple orchards that have been left to their own devices for about 30 or 40 years. And that goes back to like managing beyond your border and zooming out on the landscape. If you have an old apple orchard that's right next to a commercial orchard, the utility of that is obviously going to be less than if it's the only apple orchard in the area. If folks have done the legwork to establish a field, I typically encourage them to retain it. And so it's maintaining those niche components. And you know, to do the work to create something unique on the landscape is time well spent, and it benefits not just your property, but the wildlife in the surrounding area. So if you had something that had been kind of, you know, a field that's reverting to forest or an apple orchard that could use some TLC, it would be time well spent. The question was about patch cuts and how to mitigate invasive species into those new openings, and also about
whether it's worth
planting
pine seedlings.
Whether it's worth planting pine seedlings. So by doing the planting of the pine seedlings, what you've done is essentially move the process forward and sped it up a couple years. And I would argue that is time well spent. It's labor intensive. From forest economics courses and things that I've been involved in, my understanding is that like the opportunity cost when carried forward 100 years from a straight economist perspective doesn't warrant it. But from an ecological perspective, if you can plant trees to mitigate some of those invasives, that would be time well spent. My understanding of the patches and minimizing invasives is that invasives often colonize around the edges. And so if you were to have a larger opening, you're minimizing some of the things that are happening in the interior. And I'm sure you've heard of it, there's this whole exponential growth of invasive response. And early detection, rapid response is always preached because the amount of time, resources, and effort is most economical and efficient when you can jump on it right away. So part of that monitoring effort is, all right, we're doing a patch cut, we're trying to regenerate, going out, you know, hopefully for enjoyment, but also just to see, you know, every year is something coming in. And as a homeowner or a landowner on your own property, you don't need a license to treat the plants that are on site. And everybody's got different thresholds and tolerances for herbicide, but you can do it yourself without a license, whereas anybody else will need to be licensed to do that type of work. So the question was a follow-up question. We have a 25-year-old beech patch cut that has returned to mostly beech. And so the interesting dynamic about this that I see on the national forest is around the late 90s we had a higher moose population. And I don't know if this was the situation on your property, but moose browse was so prevalent that it did shift a lot of groups and patches to beech hell. And so what is unfortunate is that did not work for you. And so unless you do something, you know, you run the clock forward 100 years, it's going to be beech hell. And so the opportunity, you know, which I'm sure isn't encouraging news, but so, you know, maybe this would be a great opportunity though to involve NRCS. You know, they have these cost share opportunities to try to take things that you would not be able to have the resources or time to do yourself and mitigate some of those expenses. You know, with a mechanized crew, if you were doing something else in an adjacent area, I think it would be an easier sell to take some of the stumpage rates, some of the payment that they might give you for the logs, and have them, you know, essentially mow the adjacent area. The short answer is if we don't do anything, then it's going to remain the same.
Some of it was successfully brought up.
Good. And you know, this, you know, a great thing and a challenging thing is that these forest pests make things dynamic. And we have beech leaf disease in the state now, which has a pretty high rate of mortality, and a lot is still being learned about it. So the beech hell problem may solve itself. which would, you know, I say that lightheartedly, but like it would be a loss because beech and its hard mast is like an invaluable wildlife species. The fat content of a beech nut, I want to say, and I could be wrong, is like 25 times that of an acorn. So, you know, it just shows that each, you know, species has its place on the landscape. And I didn't mention it directly, but on the slide it talked about the weeds, and like we don't want to indiscriminately remove our weed trees just because they're not going to grow straight lumber for us. There's cavities, there's wildlife habitat, there's, you know, masting opportunities and all that. So that's just part of the holistic thing, you know, and something that we try to keep in mind. It's a cord of wood on how many acres? So
No, a cord of wood per acre.
per acre. So
Per acre.
I think Bill Leake, who worked at Bartlett and did a bunch of research, said that a good rule of thumb was a half a cord per acre per year is what tends to be the growth rate in the state. So I think that a cord of wood per acre per year is twice that. You're pushing it. But, you know, the opportunity to do firewood harvest on your property is great because if you select maybe those smaller suppressed trees, you're not handling the big ones on the wood splitter, but also just, you know, doing that thinning along the way and weeding your property out. So,
And you're only taking hardwoods.
right. So you're you're taking it maybe from a hardwood stand to a mixed wood stand or whatever else. I would try to do the half acre per year. So the question was about managing forests for the birds, and there are whole courses on this, which I am not an expert on, but. The two things I would think about would be the diversity that we've alluded to, because, I mean, I took a course last spring with Matt Tarr on birding, and it was amazing to learn about each species, how some of them, you know, nest at the ground level and some of them are way up at the top of the canopy. So trying to maintain that diversity would be great. It's a lot about layering, you know, how many layers are present on the forest. One thing kind of across the wildlife habitat component is that early successional forest is really stressed for those specialists that need that brushy cover, but even those generalists will move into those open areas to forage or mate. Like birds especially will go into those open areas for all sorts of different opportunities. So just based on its scarcity and its use by a diversity of species, those openings I think are one of the better tools to put in. Do we have any other questions?
All right, folks, thanks so much
Thank you.
for coming.
Thank you.